third grade. I hope that everyone has picked up their first packet of information from Parkside today and they have gotten started. I know some of you have already sent me some work. I want you to either email or text me pictures of your work, and that way you don't have to return it back to Parkside, and I can give you some feedback and let you know how you're doing on it. So far, 2 of you have done that, so the rest of you have the rest of the week to get your work done. You can send it to me each day, or you can wait until Friday and send me all of it all at one time. That is entirely up to you. Next week you will be getting more information. Packets a little bit bigger next week with a little more things to do. And again, we can keep on doing it this way, and you can be texting or emailing me pictures of your work, and that way I can have it and it doesn't have to be returned back to Parkside. So today I'm going to finish up the Virginia book. Some of you have asked me to do the second Virginia book, so I will work on the second one after we finish this one today. But let's try to finish this book today. August 30th, 1863. I am sitting on top of Cemetery Hill. There is still a faint smell of death in the air, but today all the church bells in town rang again. At our church, Reverend Macaulay said he thinks Gettysburg is starting to seem more like its old self. He said that more and more shops are opening back up and some farmers are planting a late crop. He said many buildings, though, will long show the scars of the battle. He has counted over 250 bullet holes in the trunk of one big tree near the battlefield. Reverend Macaulay said the marks of the bullets should always remind us of those who died for the cause of freedom and union. He also said that the Battle of Gettysburg has turned the tide of the war against the Confederates. September 5th, 1863. I am again sitting on top of Cemetery Hill. The birds are singing. Indeed, the hilltop this afternoon is noisy with birdsong. Paul will go back to teaching his music lessons at the seminary tomorrow. Jed often sits on the porch and writes in his copybook. I give thanks every day that we are all together again and safe. September 7th, 1863. Jed called me and Paul into the parlor today. Jane Ellen was there with him. Jed said he wanted to read to the 3 of us. He did not open The Death of King Arthur. Instead, he opened the copybook he had been writing in. He began to read in a low voice. He read about how he had been captured, how he had escaped and been wounded, how he had crawled past countless dead men and horses. Jed had written about many horrible things, but he had written in a clear and beautiful way. He wrote what he saw and what he heard. He wrote what he truly felt and what he truly thought about the war. He said the war has shown that all citizens in this country, northern and southern, are capable of evil deeds. He said we are tied to our humanity by only a slender thread, so we must all strive every day to be more loving and kind. When Jed was finished, all of us praised his wonderful writing. Jane Ellen even said she wanted to share it with the Macaulays and Mr. Hoke. At first Jed said no, but Jane Ellen was firm. She said everyone should hear his story. September 16th, 1863. Important news today. Reverend Macaulay stopped by our school to announce that Governor Curtin is going to buy property near Gettysburg for a cemetery for the Union dead. It will be on the north end of Cemetery Ridge where the wheat field, apple orchard, and cornfield once were. The bodies of Union soldiers will be removed from the shallow graves where they now lie. They will be given a proper burial in this sacred place. The new cemetery will be called the National Soldiers Cemetery. September 20th, 1863. Jane Ellen brought more exciting news from Reverend Macaulay tonight. She told us there will be a ceremony in November to dedicate the National Soldiers Cemetery. The great orator, Edward Everett, will deliver a speech. Jane Ellen said that he is the best speaker in the nation. The governors of all the northern states are invited, and cabinet members and congressmen. But the most exciting news is this. There will also be another speaker in the ceremony. It is President Abraham Lincoln himself. We could not believe this news. President Lincoln is coming to Gettysburg? October 21st, 1863. I am on Cemetery Hill. This is the first time I have been here in several weeks. My days are now filled with ordinary things, arithmetic, spelling, geography, and Latin. With so much schoolwork and chores, there has been little time to write in my journal. Thankfully, there has been little to report. No battles, no death. October 23rd, 1863. Betsy returned to school today. I did not know what to say to her. I felt she was a part of a life I used to have, not my life since the battle. October 28th, 1863. Wonderful news. Mr. Hoke showed Jed's story to his newspaper boss in Washington, D.C. The boss liked it very much. He wants to publish the whole story in his paper. But the best news is this. When Jed gets well, the boss wants Jed to move to Washington and work as a writer for the newspaper. After Mr. Hoke left, Jed called Paul and me into his room. He gave us the great news. But he said he would move to Washington only if Paul and I moved with him. Paul seemed to like the idea. He thought he could get a job teaching music at a college. Perhaps he could even play his violin in one of the theaters in Washington. As Paul and I were leaving Jed's room, Jed asked me to stay for a minute. He looked me in the eye and spoke very seriously. He said that if I kept writing when I grew up, I could write for a newspaper too. He said it was all right to have two writers in the family. He said I was at least as good a writer as he is. Our life at this moment seems truly like a dream. I like to think my mother is spinning this dream for us. November 7th, 1863. Today Jane Ellen stopped me at the door of the schoolhouse. She asked if Mr. Hoke had come to our house last night. I said yes. In a whisper, I told her the news about Jed's job in Washington. Jane Ellen smiled knowingly. I realized then, of course, that she knew all about Mr. Hoke's offer to Jed. Why, Jane Ellen was the one who had caused it to happen. From start to finish, from the moment she gave Jed the copybook. I told her that Jed wanted me and Paul to move to Washington with him. Jane Ellen said she thought I would love Washington, then a shadow crossed her face and she fell silent. I realized then that if Jed takes this job, he will not only be moving away from Gettysburg, he will also be moving away from Jane Ellen. I must talk to him about this. Later, after supper, I told Jed about my talk with Jane Ellen. I told him I was worried about her feelings. He listened carefully, then sighed. He told me to stop by his room before I go to school in the morning, but he did not say why. November 8th, 1863. Before I went to school, Jed gave me a note to take to Jane Ellen. I promised not to read it. I delivered it as soon as I got to the schoolhouse. Jane Ellen took it from me without a word. She pulled down the map of the United States. She told us all to choose a state and draw it, showing its capital and major cities. Then she slipped outside. I knew she wanted to be alone to read her note. I started to draw Washington, D.C., even though I know it is not a state. A moment later, the door opened. Jane Ellen stepped back into the room, or should I say she nearly danced back into the room. I knew at once something wonderful had happened. I quickly drew a little house on my map of Washington, D.C. I labeled it Our House. Then I drew 4 tiny people, me, Paul, Jed, and Jane Ellen. November 15th, 1863, late afternoon. I am sitting on Cemetery Hill. A cold wind is sweeping over the grass. Finally, the odor of death has left our town. In a few days, more than 15,000 people are expected to be here for the dedication ceremony. Sadly, Jed will not be able to attend. He has a cold. The doctor does not want him to risk getting pneumonia. I burst into tears at the news that Jed would not be able to see President Lincoln. He tried to cheer me up. He told me he needed me to be his eyes and ears again. He told me to take my journal and write about the whole ceremony for him. November 17th, 1863. Today we were dismissed from school so we could help clean and sweep the town for tomorrow's ceremony. I pray I can get close enough to President Lincoln to write about him for Jed. I have learned that he will be staying at Judge Willis's house tomorrow night. Judge Will's house is on the square across from the Globe Hotel. November 18th, 1863. Paul and I are standing in the twilight outside Judge Will's house. President Lincoln arrived a few minutes ago, but the crowd was so thick we could not get close to him. Paul held me up for a moment so I could see the president step out of his carriage. He is very tall with a black beard. His face has deep wrinkles. He walked slowly, not looking at anyone. I watched him go into Judge Will's house. Then the door was shut. The crowd waited in the chilly dark and sang songs below his window. An hour later, it is dark and cold now. People are still singing. Paul and I are still here waiting. We are hoping the president will come out again. Later still, the president is still inside the house. Paul thinks we should go home. He says that President Lincoln has likely retired for the night. He says the president must be giving deep thought to the words he will say tomorrow. November 19th, 1863. It is 10:30 in the morning. A heavy fog clouds the sky. President Abraham Lincoln left Judge Whewell's house a half-hour ago. He is now riding a dark mare down Baltimore Street. Following the president are Governor Curtin, 2 military bands, and many soldiers on foot and horseback. The president is dressed in black and wears a high silk hat. Later, I am standing now with the Macaulays, Jane Ellen, and Paul in the grass near the speaker's stand at the National Soldiers Cemetery. The sun is starting to shine through the clouds. President Lincoln is seated. He looks very serious. He must feel the weight of the whole world upon him. The Honorable Edward Everett is starting to speak. The crowd has grown perfectly silent. Later, Mr. Everett is still speaking. Later, Mr. Everett is still speaking. Later, my goodness, Mr. Everett has been speaking for almost 2 hours. Later, hurrah! Finally, Mr. Everett is sitting down. The band plays music. Now it is President Lincoln's turn to speak. He puts on his glasses. He takes a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He stands up. He looks at us. He speaks. Later, President Lincoln's speech was very short. When he finished, the crowd was a bit slow to applaud. I am not sure everyone understood that the president's speech was over. But slowly, the applause began to grow until it was like a mighty wave. I know you would have loved President Lincoln's speech, Jed. It was short, but it was honest and powerful, just the way you told me to write. November 20th, 1863. The newspaper printed all of President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. These are the lines I love the best. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We here highly resolve these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. November 28, 1863, tonight the Macaulays and Jane Ellen rode in the rain to our house. Mrs. Macaulay and Jane Ellen made a good meal of salt pork, yams, and biscuits. After dinner, Jed called us all into the parlor. He and Jane Ellen were holding hands. They announced that they were engaged to be married. Everyone was very happy. I think I was the happiest of all. November 29, 1863. I am sitting on top of Cemetery Hill. A golden light bathes the freshly dug graves of those who died in the battle. Last night, Reverend Macaulay said there has been praise throughout the land for President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He said that one magazine described the president's words best. They were from the heart to the heart. President Lincoln hopes that those who died this summer did not die in vain. He is praying that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. He is praying that such a nation will never perish from the earth. I think God listens to President Lincoln. I think that people like President Lincoln, Mrs. Macaulay, Mr. Hoke, Jane Ellen, Becky Lee, Captain Heath from the North Carolina mountains, Jed and Paul will keep this nation from perishing from the earth. I also think that children like me, who believe that all people are created equal, will keep this nation from perishing from the earth. I might be bold to think that, but that is truly what I think. And that's the end of Book 1. If you want to AR test on this book, the number is 40138. So you can go ahead and take an AR test on that if you would like to do that. I was thinking this weekend when I was doing some things with Elsie, that it kind of reminded me of our first reading story that we read. Do you remember the story called A Fine, Fine School? We read that a long time ago. But you might remember that Tilly was the character in that story, and she was upset because her principal wanted more school. And he wanted school on the weekends, and he wanted school at night and on the holidays. And remember, she was disappointed because there were things she was not learning. And they were simple things, like she was trying to teach her dog how to do tricks. And she wanted to teach her brother how to do things. And I was thinking that while we have all of this time out of school and we're not learning things the way that we normally do, I've heard some very interesting things from some of you about what you are learning. Some of you are doing things with your families, planting gardens, going for walks, riding bikes. Some of you are teaching your brothers and sisters things, and some of you are being taught things by your brothers and sisters. Some of you are seeing how well mom and dad can play volleyball, and you're getting to know some different things about your parents. So even though we're not in school, we're still learning things, and I want you to challenge yourselves to learn something new. Something maybe that you've started, but maybe you need to learn a little bit better. Maybe you would like to learn how to cook, or maybe you would like to learn how to do some crafts, or maybe you would like to get better at a sport. But while we have this time to slow down, stay at home with our families, that's a great time to learn something new and to be taught something by the other people who live with us. I hope that you all enjoy working through your packets. Let me know if you have any questions at all, and I will start book 2 tomorrow.